Nothing. Here we are. Welcome back, folks. This is our afternoon meeting of the Joint Justice Oversight. It is June. June 7th, not July. Like I said this morning by mistake. I was thinking of our July meeting. We're continuing our work this afternoon. And we're shifting gears to another one of our duties as a committee to look at this summer, which deals with looking at restorative justice and restorative justice programming within the state of Vermont. And let me give a little bit of background to, I know Trevor worked on this language quite a bit in conference committee. But as this started out, it started out on the House side, where there was really concern about our community justice centers in terms of the funding of the community justice centers, as well as how diverse they are in the state. And some are doing more programming and different programming than other counties. And there's really wanting to get a more cohesive look at what our community justice centers do. They've kind of developed over time, little by little. And one thing, I had some members of my committee and Trevor take a look at current statute that establishes community justice centers. And it's really a hodgepodge of statutes that are there. And even to clean up those statutes will take a tremendous amount of time. Then you layer that in with other restorative justice programs beyond your community justice centers. You've got the diversion programs, you've got the pretrial services, and maybe some other programs out there. So on the House side, we thought if we could put together a working group to really look at the community justice centers to at least see how we could coordinate their functioning and programming and how that would also work with diversion and the others. And as I worked through the legislative process, it got changed in that there would be a restorative justice study to really look at all the restorative justice initiatives that are there in Vermont, as well as our community justice centers and diversion, all of that. In the meantime, at the law school, Vermont Law School, Professor Bobby Sands has been working, he's founding director of the Center for Justice Reform. And he's been working with some of his students and really looking at our restorative justice programs here in Vermont. And one of the students has done a report on the state-funded restorative justice in Vermont. And this is the handout here that's been printed. So we have Professor Sand with us, along with some members from the law school. So Bobby, why don't you come on up and welcome.
Thank you so much. Robert Sand, the founding director, Center for Justice Reform, former Windsor County State's Attorney, and very sad to report, outgoing High Bailiff for Windsor County.
Oh my God.
It was a rough, almost two terms. I just decided I can't handle the pressure.
Sorry to miss you. We're going to miss you.
At some point, we'd love a full report on what you did.
Yeah. My people are working on that, Senator.
Thanks. Sentence report?
I'm sorry?
Is it a one sentence?
That's right. The list of duties and the number of words relate perfectly. Thank you all for serving another really challenging biennium. I know cannot have been easy. What I would love to do is give you an overview, a snapshot of some RJ issues, and then turn things over to Ping Showalter on the far left. And Ping's actually in completing her Master of Arts in Restorative Justice at Vermont Law School, did an independent research project, and the extraordinary fruits of her project are in the report that you have. So she knows way more than I do. So I'm just going to stay at a high level if that's all right. And then actually two other folks are from Valley Court Diversion, Ellen Wicklum and Lindsay, last name unknown. Parita. And Ping is interning with Valley Court Diversion right now. So if all goes well, I am sharing my screen.
There you go.
Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to emphasize is that I can't advance my screen. Is that RJ, restorative justice, is a way of thinking about how to respond to harm. It isn't simply a program or set of programs. It's a philosophy. And restorative justice centers the response on the harm and the harmed party, asking what they want and what they need. It then looks at who is responsible for causing the harm, what obligations does that responsible party have, how can that person make amends, and then RJ looks to have a net outcome. Some people say that leads to healing. I think that's asking a bit too much. So at least a net positive. A lot of our justice system responses compound harm. RJ really tries to have a net positive. So thinking about it as a philosophy, I think one can then ask, for what types of harm is this thought process appropriate? And I believe the answer is for all types of harm. There's no offense, there's no crime, there's no harm for which this thought process is not appropriate. So then you might say, well, what about incarceration? I am not a prison abolitionist. And I should say the views that I'm expressing are mine and not those necessarily of Vermont Law School. One of the most important ways that people make amends is by ensuring that they don't cause further harm. For people who present a present, ongoing risk of further harm, separation from society, separation from community becomes appropriate. So I believe you can adopt a restorative response and still have incarceration. But I share that because I hope in thinking about RJ programs, you will allow them to be used very broadly and not have statutory barriers or offense-specific barriers to RJ. One of the things I know from personal experience is that when a prosecutor pushes the envelope on using restorative response, say sending a case to diversion that has lots of marijuana plants is something that I did, the pushback wasn't to the legislature for the way the diversion statute was written. The pushback was against the prosecutor for making that decision. So the blowback, if you will, to an expansive approach to RJ won't be on the legislature. It will be on the state's attorney who makes the choice to use a restorative response. So my hope, and I apologize for the low production value of my graphics, particularly proud of this one, and then Ping gave me a really hard time about it, but what is depicted so brilliantly here is the notion that RJ can and should be a blanket that covers the whole legal system. Interestingly, I'm sure many of you know, 28 VSA section 2A already says it's the policy of the state of Vermont to consider restorative responses, but that's within, I don't mean this in any derogatory way, that's within Title 28 that addresses corrections. Why is that not also within Title 13? Why doesn't that language infuse the entire criminal code? So if this new lens, this idea of looking at everything through a restorative lens is too extreme, let me just offer. These were surgical instruments during the time of the Civil War. Here is a modern day operating room. This was advanced communication during the time of the Civil War. These things are ubiquitous. This is the layout of a courtroom at the time of the Civil War. This is a contemporary Vermont courtroom. There are few systems anywhere that have progressed less than the criminal legal system. We adopted a set of responses, honestly, largely after we eliminated slavery, but to create a workforce through convict leasing. And that has essentially perpetuated up until today. And honestly, it doesn't fundamentally change until legislatures decide to change it. You can have progressive prosecutors, you can have progressive police chiefs, but the foundational structure are the laws, and that's within your bailiwick. Okay, RJ in Vermont. Oftentimes, we talk about our restorative justice programs as off-ramps. I want to use a different extended analogy, and that is a conveyor belt. And what we do is we put cases, here we'll say coal, onto a conveyor belt, and they get sent to the crusher. And the crusher is not so interested in texture and nuance. It's a fairly blunt instrument, and it takes whatever gets sent to it. Fortunately, though, the conveyor belt is not unattended. We have, we'll call them pickers here, and the job of the picker is to look at the items of coal and select those that don't need to go to the crusher. And in fact, we have one for each county and we have one statewide. So we have 15 pickers, like we have 14 state's attorneys and one attorney general. What's interesting about the pickers is that they're going to make a decision. This piece of coal doesn't need to go to the crusher. We're going to polish it up. And maybe it doesn't come out quite that smooth, but we're going to at least smooth out the rough edges. One entity might take a piece of coal that looks like this, another that looks like this, a third that looks like this, and a fourth that looks like that. If you care about, I had to make one dad joke during my presentation. If you care about geologic justice, then maybe a system that has that much difference and disparity isn't perfect. And what we know is that different counties have different referral rates. So essentially what I've been describing is how a case gets to diversion. And we know that different counties have different rates of diversion. And so if coal were sentient, you would want to be coal likely in that bottom right-hand corner because they send a lot of cases to diversion. But it's more complicated than that. Because one of the unusual things is that in order to get plucked off the conveyor belt to go to diversion, you have to get placed on the conveyor belt in the first place. So prosecutors, pickers here, put a case on the conveyor belt, file a case in court, and then they take it off and send it to diversion. And we have some good data about which counties do that more frequently than other counties. Some prosecutors have said, however, wait a minute, it doesn't really make sense to file a case and then pull it out of court. Why don't we just send it directly to the community-based program? So instead of putting a case on the conveyor belt, we're just going to send it directly to a CJC, for example. Community Justice Center. And so the raw numbers of diversion referrals, an important figure, is not the be-all and end-all for the extent to which a restorative response is being used in a particular county. Some counties do direct prosecutorial referral. Some counties have direct police referral to a CJC. So it is a multi-layered issue. Two final things to leave you with. And here is where I probably won't get in trouble with you all, but these are two things that I think are worth considering. I'm not sure how I feel about them, but I want you to have it in the mix. So right now, the crusher, the court system, essentially has no say in what cases make it all the way to court. And it has been suggested, and Ms. Showalter refers to this in her report, reflecting a sentiment expressed by a former chief judge in Vermont, that maybe the judiciary, maybe the people who run the crusher ought to have the ability to say, you know what, this case shouldn't come all the way to the crusher. So the question is, should judges have the ability to send cases to diversion or some other community-based response? Currently, that is a prosecutorial decision. Next issue, challenging, deals with money and funding. In those locations where there is robust use of community-based restorative responses, by definition, that lowers the volume of cases that the court has to hear. We don't make any financial adjustment to anybody in those places with high referral rates as compared to low referral rates. And it's at least worth pondering, A, do we want to incentivize high referral rates for out-of-court resolution? And B, in those places that do that, should there be some reallocation of funding, arguably from the judiciary, that has saved the work of having to process all those cases to perhaps the county-based programs that are picking up that workload? Happy to answer questions. Really just wanted, that was a perfect response. Chair Emmons was just to create some.
I would like to thank you, Bobby, and I sincerely hope that you get over not being high bailiff.
Thank you. With your support.
I know it'll be a tough transition.
Support groups.
But you raised some interesting issues about restorative justice, and we just had a conversation at lunch about somebody who's not eligible for expungement or sealing because the crime occurred at a time when things were different. But I know today in almost any county in the state, that criminal activity would have been diverted. It's 30 years old and times have changed. So with that perspective, I mentioned that as something that perhaps we should also be looking at is how does diversion fit in with older offenses? Could people go through a diversion program in order to get an expungement, for example, or sealing of their record? It's a thought. Secondly, the geographic justice is something that both Representative Brad and I think other members of this committee have been dealing with for years. One of the problems is what you have in one county may not match what you have in another county. For example, resources in terms of mental health resources in terms of a drug court, resources in terms of a mental health court, resources in a veterans court, other things that you could use. So, as I look at this system, we've also created part of that. In Bennington, I now have a pocket program. It's for kids who are under the age of 10, who are exhibiting extreme problems within their classroom. It's operated by the designated agency. Those kids can go to that program during the day, so they're not a problem in the school. They're getting mental health treatment. It's an experimental program. We've got that now in Bennington, so those are less kids, perhaps in the future, but you don't have that in Washington County, for example. So somehow we need to also track what it is that is available statewide and what is available in the local areas for diversion.
But also, under our current system, the principal decision maker is the elected state's attorney.
Right.
So without guidance, you're necessarily going to get significant variation based upon who the decision maker is in each of the 14 counties.
Yep.
I will say, while it is true there are different levels of resources county by county, an enterprising entrepreneurial state's attorney can make something work, much like you figured out how to pilot a program in Bennington County. So I don't think, I would not be too receptive to the argument. I wish I could do more as state's attorney. We just don't have that program. I think the state's attorney can drive the creation of that. So it's really philosophical. And it's hard because on the one hand, we have counties as laboratories. You created a new thing and that could become a model for the rest of the state. So we want that innovation at the county level. On the other hand, some consistency of approach is probably necessary for geographic justice. It has never sat well with me and others here. I know that what side of the county line you are on is going to influence oftentimes significantly what the outcome is going to be. That doesn't feel like a justice system.
So where do the state's attorneys look to for direction? I know they're elected by the voters of the county, which is one piece. But for initiatives, such as what is occurring in Bennington County that was just mentioned, if there is a state prosecutor that's involved with helping establish a program, do the state's attorneys tend to put a little bit more focus instead of themselves in terms of establishing a program? Would they look to the judge? What if a judge really, really felt strongly about some restorative justice's practices? And judges do rotate. Do the judges control any of that, or is it all in the state's attorney's hands? Or do some state's attorneys work with the judge if the judge wants to go in a particular direction?
All of the above. I think the most successful programs have been collaborations. So a team of folks in Windsor County had the opportunity to go to San Diego in February. And the offer was extended to all the state's attorneys. And I said, heck yeah. And that became the catalyst for starting our first and still only DUI treatment court. So that was a collaborative effort. But I will say, I hope you folks will push a little bit. I mean, state's attorneys are sworn to uphold the law. And if you say, please make it a priority, or state's attorneys, we would like to see your plan so that we can do a comparative assessment of what's happening in one county as compared to what's happening in another county. I think that'd be really helpful. I'll be honest, I spent some time working with the legislator, trying to rewrite the high bailiff position to have that person become essentially an ombudsperson between the county and the legislature. And for a variety of reasons, that didn't go anywhere. But I do think state's attorneys are these little fiefdoms, which is wonderful if you're, I don't know, if you're the head of, right, what's the head of a fiefdom called? I don't know, the head fief. But they're not so good at cross-pollinating and sharing. So they get to the county line, and you know what happens in Chittenden County does not necessarily happen in Franklin County. And you know, we have many elections coming up in November for new state's attorneys. But I do think the legislature can say it is our hope and expectation that state's attorneys will develop, I'll go back to the original analogy, off-ramps at every step of the way. One of the things that we are starting to appreciate on the national level, and I think starting to appreciate it here, but it is, I feel this much more powerfully than I did when I was a prosecutor. Even misdemeanors, a conviction for a misdemeanor can change the course of a person's life, often for the worse. And I think it behooves all of us to really work hard to keep people from getting that initial misdemeanor conviction. And that is not to say that there shouldn't be accountability there. Absolutely should be accountability. But we should really look hard for how we can achieve that accountability without saddling people with a conviction. Because it is, even with the great work that's happened with expungement, it is a brand that follows that person around long past the time they've done their sentence. And I don't mean this disrespectfully, but that's in your control. The legislature controls how long after they've satisfied the judicial punishment, they're still going to be branded as a criminal. So I think guidance to prosecutors, they're generally pretty dutiful, is something that would be useful.
I appreciate that, but I have to remind you that the governor.
I was just gonna say, the veto
The
power
governor
had
just
something to do
vetoed
with
the
it.
expungement.
I know.
So it's not all.
Nothing's easy.
That pen ran out of ink apparently. So
So while we heard you, Bobby.
I understand. One of the favorite expressions that I heard early on in learning about RJ was nothing about us without us. And to the extent that you all have an interest in convening stakeholders as you look at RJ responses more broadly, and to the extent that the law school can play any role in helping with that, that I think would align really nicely with what we're doing. I mean, you know, implicit in what I presented, and I recognize I didn't talk about BARGE, balanced and restorative justice for juveniles. I didn't talk about COSA, circles of support and accountability. There is tension, I think is a fair word, between diversion and CJCs and who gets what and what the funding stream is. It's wonderful and curious that the Department of Corrections funds front-end programs, pre-charge programs. That doesn't sort of naturally sit as something that one would expect. I certainly understand the DOC being involved in probation and within facility programming and post-release programming, but upfront programming, that's unusual.
But you know where that came from?
Probably John Gorsuch and John
It did.
Kerry. Right.
It absolutely did in the mid-90s. about 97, 98. He's the one that put on the table a form of restorative justice to repair the harm. Because he was very clear, why are we spending taxpayer dollars for a hard bed in a corrections facility for our low risk, low severity of crime folks, when that should be dealt with at the community level to repair the harm? And the funding originally came from DOC because of that.
I think Commissioner Gorsuch envisioned that the municipalities and towns would pick that up at some point. And it's an important program. I think it's a very fair question to ask. Should cases have to be filed in court before they can go to the community program? The diversion statute specifically says that diversion, you can't send a case to diversion until probable cause has been found, meaning until a case is filed in court. Seems to me we might want a robust system of pre-charge referrals. Who's the right entity to pay for that?
And how would that tie in with the pretrial services that are funded through the AG's office?
Right, I mean, I don't know that pretrial services are envisioned to be the final outcome. I've always understood them, I think I might have had something to do with getting that law passed, as a way to support and stabilize people while their case is pending, with the notion that we all benefit from that. And even if the outcome is less punitive, hopefully it is less punitive because a person has become stabilized by virtue of working with the pretrial monitor, if we're still calling the people pretrial coordinator, that's a net benefit for all of us. But it isn't diversion successfully completed, case goes away. Pre-charge program successfully completed, case goes away. Pretrial services, as I understand it, doesn't inherently envision the termination of the case.
That's correct.
Helen.
I come from Valley Court Diversion. Pretrial services is a program matching a defendant with somebody at a diversion office who can link them up with substance misuse programs or help them find housing or work on getting their driver's license back, get them into mental health treatment while their case is pending and working its way through court. So it doesn't, it's exactly as you said, Bobby, it supports the person while they're going through the regular court process, but it has no effect on the outcome of the court case.
But it could have a significant outcome in terms of the sentence that's finally given, correct?
Yes, it could, and to community, public safety and community stability and individual stability and health and everything, that's what it was.
Think about a defendant with an active substance abuse issue, and it remains an active issue at the time of conviction and sentencing. That may yield one kind of outcome versus another defendant who's perhaps become stabilized and is on medication-assisted treatment and gets convicted. That sentence may look very differently. And likely a less punitive response, but it's not a guarantee.
Are there any counties in the pretrial system? Are there any counties that depend on the Justice Center in that county?
For pre-charge?
Pretrial services? None of us, it goes through the diversion?
Diversion.
The Attorney General's office funds court diversion, Tamarack, and pretrial services. So that all comes to a court diversion office.
So none of the pretrial services, there's no pretrial monitor or coordinator that's housed in a community justice center?
Not in a justice center.
There's
Except-
six
Oh, yeah, there's 6 CJCs that do like everything though, so they have barge, then they do court diversion, then they also do like.
That's where your layers build on your community justice centers. That's what I'm trying to get at.
So just to clarify that, some counties have a diversion office and a separate community justice center. In 6 counties, they're merged under one roof. So everything gets funneled to that one location, and then they decide what's the right level of restorative response or programming. So some have suggested that's a little bit like a designated agency that we use in the mental health field. We're going to send it to one, and then they're in charge of, and there are pros and cons to that.
And there's more streams of funding coming into those 6 than the others.
Yes, it's
Complicated.
complicated.
Excuse me, so even if in a county where everything's together under one roof, pretrial services is always funded by the Attorney General's office. It's part of the diversion part of the justice system. The CJC might be under the same roof, but they're funded by the Department of Corrections and they run different programs. They don't run pretrial services.
Right, but what I'm saying is that in those 6 situations, those 6 counties, you've got the diversion and CJCs are under one roof, but you've got different streams of funding coming in there, whereas CJC in another county that is not having the diversion under their roof doesn't have all of those same streams of funding coming in.
Yes.
That's why we're looking at this. Trying to figure it out. So should we transition?
That would be
Hank?
great. Thank you. Thanks for the time.
It's a good transition because it gets really tricky with all of those logistics, and I scratched my head over all of them for about a semester. So let me screen share this. Let's see here. I always hate this moment when it takes me 8 years to figure out how to do something I've done 20 times.
And we're not the only ones.
I was about to say I'm young, but I don't want to, step on my toes. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm Ping Showalter, and I'm a current student at Vermont Law School, and I'm finishing up my master's in restorative justice right now, and it's been wonderful. And so this last semester, I got to work with Bobby Sand, Professor Sand. I don't think I've ever called you Bobby before.
Hi, Bailiff.
Hi, sorry. His Highness. But let me see if I can move this. Oh, never mind. You guys see something else that I see. Perfect. So in front of you guys have my report, which was funny enough because it came about after like a pretty casual conversation that the two of us had. And I wanted to do an IRP and an independent research project. And I kind of had just been like, I really noticed that there's some inefficiencies with CJC funding. And Professor Sand was like, yes, that's a great project. You should do it. And I was like, okay, a 2 credit, maybe investment. I'll write a little report. Maybe I'll even get to interview someone, pretty excited. And then it turned into this very, very intensive, pretty deep project that really looks at these 3 different state-funded restorative justice providers with the CJCs, with court diversion, with barge. And it was really interesting to really start from that one little node and then realize like I couldn't look at that without having to look at the entire system because there's so much overlay with the funding, there's so much overlay with the structure. And you really can't look at one without having to dig deep into the logistics of everything, which was both a wonderful opportunity to talk with a lot of individuals and also definitely very overwhelming. So thank you for letting me come and speak, and just an extending a universal thanks to all of the people that really helped me with this project and dealt with some silly and some serious questions, and it's been good. But like teacher, like student, I also wanted to start with a little image, which is actually how my report starts, with a picture of a barn, or that's not a barn, a farmhouse, there you go. And it kind of is drawing from Derek Newdovnik, who's the community and restorative justice executive for the DOC. And he talked about CJC funding being this farmhouse, where it had this infrastructure in the beginning. And then what we do to it is we add on to it, we add little bits like piece by piece, and it kind of creates this hodgepodge like infrastructure that only when you step back do you realize it might not make that much sense. There's like add-ons that don't necessarily gel together. And something that I was kind of looking at, what I eventually concluded, is that it's not just one farmhouse. Vermont is this huge acre of land, right? And then there are all these different farmhouses and they all look a little different. And maybe they can see each other and maybe they talk some, but really they're functioning on their own. The people in those areas are going to those. And so it creates this system where they all exist, but we're not really sure what role they're playing or how they can help each other or collaborate. And so my role, this is me, actually. Yeah, I know, I look a little different. It's really funny. I searched land surveyor, which I never knew that this is what land surveyors use. So when you see those people, that's what they're doing. But this is a guy from Vermont, actually. So I thought it was a sign that I should keep running with this analogy, right? But I really thought like my role isn't necessarily to advocate for particular legislation, but it's to take, like look at everything that's in front of us and really analyze the different perspectives, the opinions, the structures and funding that make up this whole landscape. And something that I really learned is that it's really important to have this neutral person that honestly knows nothing in the beginning, because it's really taking a survey of like all the experts in the room who have been doing this work for lots and lots of years, but maybe aren't talking with every other piece. And so when I get to come in and do that and make these connections, that's been really, really important. And that's what a lot of this looks at. And so let's see. There we go. So this document, some of you might have seen Letha Cipriano's community-based restorative justice providers document. And this lays out how complex of an issue it is with all of the counties, then the 3 funding streams, and then sorry, what?
Page 12.
Oh, yes, thank you. Sometimes I added page numbers, sometimes I got a little lazy, but yeah, that was one of the documents that I remember I got and my jaw just kind of dropped because I was like, I don't know how to unpack this and I don't really know everything that it means. And the problem is now it makes a lot of sense to me. If you don't know this landscape, then it's just a lot of confusing acronyms, basically, is how I would look at it. And so my job was to really go into each of these and figure out what problems are each of them facing? What are the solutions in front of us? And so this is something that I created because I'm very, very tech savvy. And I asked everyone I interviewed this question. I said, how would you guys describe the RJ landscape? And some of them were based off of restorative justice, right? We have localized, human, needs-based. But a lot of them were looking at this system level of like the issues that are in front of us. It's inefficient, under-resourced, confusing, unregulated. And one that really stuck with me was disjointed. This issue where there's lack of communication and collaboration. And so what I initially had been viewing is these 3 pillars and these 3 forms of RJ. Really, if I want to keep running with this like farm life analogy, are these silos of different forms of RJ that aren't necessarily building off of each other and therefore continuing to be inefficient in ways that I think we could solve, or at least we need to push back. Oh, I get to do this. Okay. Ben is coming in. I just admitted so much power all at once. It's a rush.
Ben woke up.
Long enough. And so I don't know if any of you guys have been able to look at my report before.
No, we just
5 minutes.
Got it, yeah.
Okay, well, wonderful. So this is kind of an overview of what I cover. So I go through the history and the initial vision of each of these, which Professor Sandin talked about a little, the statutory framework, which really does emphasize how RJ is built into that, but there is that weird disconnect between Title 13 and 28. Woo, yes, okay. See, that's the interesting thing. When a semester project you like check off suddenly becomes like relevant, and I'm like, okay, I gotta remember everything. And then I talk a little bit about the current landscape. And then what I really want to talk about today too are the existing tensions and these possible solutions. And then I also end with just acknowledging some of the resources that I used and the people I talked with. But the big first thing was addressing this funding question. And I really came at like 3 of these overarching solutions. We were looking at increasing funding, consolidating funding, and then diversifying funding. And I'm really glad I was here in the morning because you guys did talk a lot about justice reinvestment too. And that was something that I ended up talking to a lot of people about. And this idea that we're investing in decarceration and reducing our population here in Vermont, reducing our incarcerated population in Mississippi, which when I did this project, there are 127, and then I checked today and there are 123 housed in Mississippi right now. And so just acknowledging like those funds are out there, how can we make sure like we have a standing transfer of money that comes from the general fund that can go towards restorative programs and processes? I think that's really crucial. And I do think that's something that, when you write this, I wasn't sure how relevant it is because this whole project was jumping on a moving train where you're privy to some conversations, but a lot of them are happening without, students' knowledge. So it's really cool to hear how that's progressing. And that's also something I would emphasize. And then also this cannabis tax revenue. I was doing some research, and in 2021, there were 11 states that got revenue from cannabis sales, and then 4 of them put that money into restorative and equity services and programming. And so I just think these are like 2 things that can at least stretch the brain and think about ways we can increase funding, because a lot of CJCs and court diversion are level funded, which really is translating into being underfunded because cost of living is going up, costs are increasing, and yet the pay remains the same, the grants remain the same or relatively the same, and that's definitely a burden. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about consolidating funding. That's pretty much what it says, is just like taking those streams and putting them into one just for a bit more efficiency. I talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people had like both the pros and the cons of that. So it was really interesting to see some people really advocating for that, and other people saying it might take away some accountability from the AGO, from DOC, from DCF. If it's consolidated, who's ultimately responsible for making sure that that money gets handed out? And then, sorry, I can't see my own. Wait, yes, I can. I can look up here. And then there is diversifying funding, and that's really asking who is responsible for restorative justice in Vermont. And as we covered there, those big 3. And then we're looking at, is there a role that the court should be playing, which Professor Sandin mentioned, with just the idea that they are receiving benefits, some obvious, some not as obvious. What is their role in making sure restorative justice is an option for as many people as possible? Other people talked about, other interviewees and people who took my survey, they talked about assistance from the local community, from a community tax, from just other forms of municipal monies. And of course, this really is highlighting this potential funding gap that could arise if the DOC does acknowledge that statutorily they don't have an obligation for those pre-charge cases. What happens if they remove that money from restorative justice? Then there's this gap that opens up, and suddenly we very urgently need to find something that's going to go in and fill it. And so that's a concern that a lot of people discussed, was what are we going to do when that happens? Because right now it's looming, and yet the action is not necessarily being taken to address it. See, the other big part I focused on was structure. I focused on the ultimate structure of it, and then on improving some structural things. This slide, this is on page 32, and that kind of just summarizes these 3 different levels of rearranging the structure, from a completely new central authority to just merging some things to just adopting a new model that we could adapt a little bit. At the very top, you can see that Department of Community Justice, which some interviewees mentioned. What would happen if we created this entirely new department? How feasible is that? What would that even look like? Which is a huge step, but definitely worth considering. The Office of Racial Equity was something that was really intriguing to me because it really takes into account how RJ is based in equity and racial justice. And there is that element that needs to be there that in Vermont, obviously a very white state, is a concern with a lot of restorative practitioners, is what's that balance look like? And then there's like a central office with satellite hubs, which is, I don't want to regurgitate everything because it definitely all is in my report, but that's just like a step down. Going down is a merge with just combining what we were talking about with 6 CJCs, having all those services, making that more universal in every county. And that's definitely a move that a lot of places are making, is merging that. And then also, we've also had some merges with just CJCs to combine services, just to be more efficient. And that also really looks at Chittenden because obviously there are 4 CJCs there. What's the efficiency of that? And then the existing model is the designated agency model that the Department of Mental Health already has. So those are some like big structural changes. Oh, sorry, I thought you were. And then the final bit that I really talked about was general structural stuff. And I really focused on the referral process, which I guess the main part that I really wanted to pay attention and want to emphasize to you all is this approving accountability through relationships. I think a lot of this accountability towards restorative justice can be built at this level of communication and of talking and collaborating and like what we're doing right now, and obviously legislation, because that's what we're here to talk about. But I do think that the referral process right now is a disjointed, unclear. The relationship between prosecutors and police and providers, it can be complicated and it's not equal in every county. So that's something I really noticed talking with everyone. A lot of them would be like, I can tell you what mine's doing, but I have no idea what the other counties are doing. And I don't think it's the same thing. And I think that that's an issue. And then the other things I just kind of touched on were the disparities. I talked about data, and like the transparency and accessibility of it. And then I talked about a lack of oversight and both the positives and negatives of that, where there is that local ability to do what you want, but also what does that mean in terms of having cohesion? Right. Okay, let me try this. All right, so then these are really those key ideas. I really like when things, when they all start with the same letter, because it makes my head, it just really satisfying. So I was looking at effective funding, equitable services, and efficient structures. And I think those 3 things, those are really what I see as the pillars, not necessarily, CJCs, court diversion, barge, not the actual agencies, but like, what are we trying to do with restorative justice? I think we're trying to find effective funding to give equitable services, and we're trying to do it through efficient structures. And right now, I don't know if that's there with what we currently have. And then, of course, I'm looking at the power of providers, prosecutors, and police. I think those 3 players are so critical in this conversation. And yet I often think about how they aren't in communication with each other, maybe even outside just like the local, like maybe they are just locally, but not at a wider scale. And then I also wanted to do this like number breakdown, which I'm like thinking about it and I'm like, do I even remember what all these numbers are? But I was looking at it like there are 17 CJCs in 14 counties. There are 12 court diversion offices where there are 10 per county, and then yet 2 both serve 2 counties. And then that goes along with 11 barge providers, 10 of which are with the court diversion providers, but then 1, Addison County, does Easter Seals for barge, and then 6 of them hold all 3 contracts. So I say that all, and it's just like, that's a very confusing thing for people to wrap their minds around. And it just doesn't make sense that that continues to be a system that if we're not at least, like if we're not fixing it, we have to explain it over and over. And it's very difficult to change something if you don't understand it. And I think that's where we're at with a lot of this stuff. And so that leads me to these key takeaways is that, so I'm with court diversion right now at Valley Court, and we had a VACT out meeting with the Vermont Association for Case Managers and Coordinators up in Killington. And this was something I kind of noticed in all my conversations was that suddenly I'm surrounded by all these people who are each experts at their own place. And yet this is the first time I'm having these conversations and learning what other people do and getting to share like what we do at our organization. And I think there was an element of surprise to all those conversations that I think it would just be better if we had those more routinely, if we found ways to connect. And so that's really a core that I have pulled out throughout this project is just how much expertise is out there and yet how much I don't think we utilize it, which goes back to my willingness to engage. I talked to so many people were willing to talk to me. And I just think it's really cool to see like when there is that level of investment, and yet how do we capitalize on that? And I think moving forward, like this study, this project would help with that. And then the final thing I do want to emphasize is this importance of the local. I talked with everybody, and as much as people might have been advocates for consolidation, they all recognized how crucial local services are to restorative justice. And remembering that just because we call something restorative doesn't necessarily mean that it is. So there really has to be that thread of what truly is restorative and how can we uphold that. And so this is like, I guess, my final question about what does RJ success look like? And once we find answers to that, I think that's when we can really start to tackle these logistical questions and problems. So yeah, that's my overview of the project.
Wow. I think you summed up very well what we're trying to get at. We had a concept of how complicated it is, but we never could get our hands around it. I think you've gotten your hands around it, and that's going to be very, very helpful for us. Have you submitted, both of you, your PowerPoint to Peggy Delaney so it can be posted on our webpage?
I've not, but I can.
And that would be very helpful. I think
They're both there.
Are they there? The other thing that would be helpful is the graphic that you had, where it's 17 of the 14 of, if you could write that out so we know what the numbers pertain to, I think that sums it up for us pretty well.
For sure, yeah.
That would be really helpful because you just rattled it off because you know it so well.
And the problem is that's always shifting and changing. Like I had to revise, I kept getting annoyed because I'd be in my final edits and someone would be like, another CJC merged. And I'd be like, okay, great. Actually, that only happened like once or twice, but it is, it is a fact that these are shifting and that's wonderful, but it can be hard to keep up in terms of how we continue to change them. And that's something I kind of experienced is it's not necessarily public knowledge immediately when these changes are made or these merges happen. So how can we keep up with them and make sure we're factoring that into our discussions?
I think the report's going to be very helpful. It's a chance to take a look at it, I think. Questions? Thoughts? Teresa?
My only question is when you're done at Vermont Law School, you're planning to stay in Vermont.
Oh, no.
That's what we need to work on.
Yeah.
They tried.
They've tried hard. I'm actually headed to Peru to do Peace Corps.
Oh, well, you can do that and then come back to Vermont.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Peace Corps
Yeah.
alum here.
That's right.
Really?
Yeah. So, thank you for your work. Yeah, it's actually for somebody who doesn't live, I'm a human services person, so I don't live in this world during the session, and it's actually really helpful.
I'm glad. Yeah. It's interesting to take what I thought would just be an academic thing and then get to apply it and put it in a real setting. And yeah, I appreciate it.
I think what was also interesting, there are legislators who are just concerned about the system itself and seeing the competing forces per se. I mean, people have their silos, like CJCs or diversion or some of the other programs. And it's like, how is all this coordinated? Because everyone's coming in here asking us for money. And how do we know that it's being spent appropriately and it's being effective? And that's what sort of instigated some of the conversations. Because I was reached out to by the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House and said, look, we've got some issues here with the CJCs, diversion, all of this money, and we can't seem to track it and figure out what they're all doing. So we had a few legislators, a few folks working to try to get at least their hands around the CJCs from county to county or area to area. And the more you started digging, the more complicated it got. So you did a lot of the work that we were trying to do over the past few months. Now, how we go forward with this, I don't know, but that's something this committee is going to have to come in with some recommendations on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to, there's one page in here that I didn't want to put here because I wanted to be able to like talk through things rather than just read through, but page 17, that outlines really the big parts of it where I look at the existing tensions of both funding and structure, and then laying out generally the possible solutions of each. And so that gives kind of the broadest scope, at least in one page and in one diagram of what we're working with. And then at the end, I kind of tackle some of like my own, like, this is what the majority of people were saying. This makes the most sense to me of suggestions, but it is, hopefully it gives that groundwork layer. But I do want to emphasize though, that all this is coming from interviews and surveys and a lot of primary information that I'm gathering. And so that's been something that's both scary to try to understand what these experts are saying and then make sure I'm representing it accurately. But it is coming from that lens of, let's see what most people are saying, and then using that to kind of synthesize and analyze these funding and structure issues.
Terrific. Thank you. Questions, thoughts?
Thank you.
You've done terrific work.
Yeah.
Thank you. When do you head to Peru?
Yeah. Mid-September.
So we can call you back if you want.
Oh, yeah. A few more. What are these interim sessions? Is that what they're called?
Yeah. Anything else?
Very helpful.
Great. So if you could submit the explanation of those numbers, 17 or 14 of,
Yeah,
like, that's about as far as I got.
yeah, absolutely. I'll add that to my PowerPoint, make sure I get that. And then
Further, I guess I do have one question, maybe
Yeah.
either. In 3 cases, there are towns or cities that have their own community justice center. How that confuses things. They're funded by DLC, I believe. So that also because basically we've been talking about 14 counties, but in Chittenden County, you have 3 different towns.
Not the 17.
Yeah, but in some, like in my district,
Yeah.
we had a CJC in my community that did not get refunded by DOC and went to a community down the road in a different county that hadn't been existing very long. And that blew up some concern in my community that why didn't we get funded? So, there's this tension that's happening out there.
And it exists at the very local level, like when you have a CJC, when you have a court diversion office, like right down the road from each other, like it's just like those exist everywhere. Not that we have. That's where we are. Yeah, but it does highlight that there is that tension. And then with Chittenden, there is the big one that does everything. And then there are all these additional CJCs. And then that gets back to this question of geographic justice, and something that I've definitely been wrestling. Well, I've been wrestling with all of these issues, obviously, but something that has stood out to me is that it doesn't necessarily, like, there are those CJCs that are nonprofits, and then there are also ones that are housed with, I think there's one in Chittenden that's housed within the police department. And so it just brings into question, like, what are those levels?
So how are the CJCs established?
So that's been part of the issue.
Yeah, right now it's like each municipality gets the authority to have a CJC, and then it's up to them if they want to allocate that out to a nonprofit or they want to be responsible for it. And so almost everywhere it's a nonprofit as far as I'm aware of, but there is like a few that it's with the actual municipality. But that's, yeah, there's technically in the statute.
It's at the local level that it's
Yes.
established, they decide.
And the statute's just a hodgepodge because they've been added on to in such an ad hoc way that there's no cohesiveness even in the current statute about restorative justice and about the CJCs. So, and initially the thinking was, back in the 90s, was at a local level, you work with a person to repair the harm. That was the secret. And then it's just kind of blossomed into the system we have now. And people are saying, maybe we really need to start looking at this system and see what is our goal? And is it achieving our goal?
It doesn't seem like, I think it's what I would loosely describe as a system. It seems more like a conglomeration of, a bunch of disparate but connected entities and ideas in terms of outcomes. And the challenge that we face is that, you know, we know well enough in this building that proposing change to something that exists right now, the status quo has a lot more power than the desire to change, even if change, you know, is really well supported by, you know, research like yours and others. So that's the challenge that we in this building need to overcome.
Professor Sand?
What I have not seen is a comprehensive reform proposal. And that would be really interesting. I mean, it's, the work that Ping did is extraordinary, it's a daunting task. But so then the question is, well, what, if we were to come up with a new system, what would that look like? And I have not seen that document.
Yeah.
Have you seen that anywhere?
I definitely am not, because I would have jumped on that and been like, this is great. Yeah, because I think it goes back to, that is both the wonderful part about RJ and the really hard part about it, is it's so personal, so localized, and so seeped in relationship. It can be hard to look at closure rates, or it can be hard to look at, oh, these people were able to do exactly this on a contract that made it successful. And so when you go out that easy quantitative analysis, figuring out what's successful and then getting everyone to agree that that's what that success looks like and here's how we can pursue it, is a very daunting, challenging task. And yeah.
I think we can still make more sense out of a system while not losing those local relationships that are really important to the success of RJ.
Yeah.
So I think both can be accomplished. And if we were setting forth, if we were building a system today, knowing now what we know, we wouldn't build something that looks like this. I hope, let's just say.
Ben has his. Dick and then Ben.
I do think there's, even if you only reform the funding stream so that they're all under one organization, and it's crazy, DCF funds some of it.
Yeah.
DOC funds some of it. The general fund funds some of it. And I was looking at the numbers that I was given, I don't know if they're accurate. The DOC program got a 7% increase this past budget year. The programs operated by the Attorney General's office or funded by the Attorney General got a 3% increase. And the DCF operate on grants. So if you're trying, it's just extremely confusing as to why one particular program under DOC would get 7%. If you're operating one program, like Bennington is, with both DOC, DCF, and all that, they can kind of work that through. But if you're under the grant proposal with one program and under this and that, it just really is confusing. So this has been extremely helpful. Your report and Bobby's comments, extremely helpful, at least in looking at the funding side of it. It makes no sense.
And just to go off this one continuous conversation that Professor Sand and I'm sorry, I know you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to reply to that really quickly. It was that it gets confusing because there's some like CJCs, well, it's really up to the prosecutor if they do pre-charge, if they do court diversion. So it could look like there's a whole bunch of closures happening pre-charge and then nothing at court diversion. So we assume there's not much RJ happening there if you just look at court diversion numbers, when in actuality, you have to take into account those different referral intercepts and realize that there is a lot. But when it is broken up and stratified like that, it can be harder to identify it when it's not all in one location. So another layer of complication to the funding.
Just as far as the point about a comprehensive reform, I do know that there were reports done in 2014, 2015, and 2017 about, I think, creating a single unified restorative justice council, essentially. And I don't know how in depth those went.
They probably went on the shelf.
I actually used them for my report and they did a really good job helping me with like the history, but honestly, they stopped at 2016. So there was that effort for a council, but it really didn't result in action.
Who did the reports? Who?
It was a group, Association of Court Diversion Programs, Community Justice Network, large providers, DCF, DOC, the AG's office, Center for Crime Victim Services, and
Current players, in other words.
Sounds so duplicative.
Well,
That's a dead end.
I think you should do an addendum to the digger story about kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, that was the RJ working group.
you and me, because we went back and forth.
I think you would share that here.
No. Whoops.
That's what often happens. That's what often happens, that the reports hit a dead end.
Well, let's not have a dead end on this one. We're doing some work, and this is a good transition before we get to DOC coming in for updates for us as a committee to talk about how we go forward here over the next few months. You have another question
I
for
do.
Pink?
Okay. So when you were compiling your funding source and funding report here, did you form an opinion on whether DOC should be involved in this at all?
I think it's hard because right now, if we removed it, I just can't even imagine what that would look like. So in my head, it's like they do have a place, because I do think there's a lot of restorative work that happens during incarceration, after incarceration. And I think that removing them from the scene, I think restorative justice should be something that's present at all layers. And so do I see the DOC in charge of needing to help fund, needing to be a part of it? Absolutely. Do I see them being responsible at every layer and removing responsibility from other entities? Absolutely not. Like, I think that there's a huge need for other groups to step in and fill some gaps and take some of the weight off of a group that is itself debating, like, what is their role and what do they have to do? Because once they decide, if they decide I'm done, then what are we left with if we haven't thought about these questions?
So you think they should stick their finger in the pie? It's just a matter of degrees and how deep.
How deep it goes. Yes, I like that. I think I do like pie, so I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ping.
Thank you very much. This is helpful. I'm sure we'll be reaching out, continue our work. So what are some of the items that I'm interested in? We're due to meet again on Tuesday, July 12th. Does that still work for folks?
Works for me.
Yeah, that's fine.
Still works for folks? And we can start at 10 instead of 9:30?
That works better.
That works
for me.
better for me too. 9:30 was a
I was on the
little.
road at 7 this morning
Yeah,
because of construction and traffic had just made it.
yeah, I know. I was thinking of it because I didn't get on the road till 8. I wanted to get on the road earlier and I didn't.
I can't make it on the 12th.
You can't make it on the 12th. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So it looks like 12th works for the majority of folks. So we have 3 things in terms of what we need to deal with on the 12th. On July 12th. The DCF report on the secure placement of our juveniles. That would be a preliminary report. There'd be also a DOC report on the midpoint probation review, and there would be the DMH report, preliminary, on the competency to stand trial and insanity as a defense. And that's kind of leading up to the whole discussion of forensic unit. So those are the 3 given for our next meeting. Other items? That's a lot, but we've got a lot of work in terms of doing the interrogation piece and this restorative justice piece. Is there thoughts on just dealing with one of those next on the 12th?
I wonder if we could get Stephanie in to go over the funding and the streams that are used to fund all 3 of those. Quite frankly, as a member of appropriations, I should know all this, but, it's, it's daunting just to figure all 3 of them out and where it's all going and how, You know, and then we're sitting there at the last minute and this one gets 7%. I don't know how that happened.
No, I agree with you. We took some JR2 money when we're having a conversation about the JR2 out-of-state savings. And we decided to, in consultation with corrections and
I
institutions.
wonder what would happen financially also if we had one system, one name, one administrative.
Don't know.
Well, I know, yeah, there were different requests and there were different pieces of money. We just made decisions about it, right?
Yeah, individually,
Individually, you're absolutely right.
but not as a
I mean,
system.
the barge fund came late in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was up 250,000.
So it was one time.
Yeah, one-time money.
So do folks want to spend some time working on the funding for the restorative justice?
Well, that's part
And at our next meeting?
Yes. Sure.
We want to do that and then do the interrogation and coercion more in September. I don't know if we're going to have time to.
Well, with the three things and then with that budget piece, I don't think we're going to have time to do that in
Right,
July.
right. That's what my concern is too. So we could get Stephanie in. We should also have the players like DOC, Attorney General, and DCF in just to
Right.
talk about how their funding stream works for restorative justice
Right.
and JR2.
Do they even talk to each other?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we'll figures that out. And then in September, we can spend more time on the interrogation and coercion. I mean, that one, we're due for, we're gonna look at that.
Personally, I think our time would be better spent looking at what Oregon and Illinois did in juvenile and start there. I think it's a huge can of worms opening up.
Oregon, and what was the other state?
Illinois.
Illinois. And I know, I think Utah just did the juveniles too. Like Shirling suggested, we focus on juveniles.
Juveniles. That's gonna, would that be something Ben could be looking at for us? Who could be looking for Oregon and
Michelle's stepping.
Michelle?
If she's stepping.
Yeah, Michelle's the one who's doing that section. Maybe Michelle could do a little digging. Because that really, we need to get started on
Do you have
that.
some interns this year?
Yeah, during the session,
You know, summer?
not that I'm aware of, May, but.
Maybe we connect with Michelle and see if she can do looking into Oregon and Illinois.
I'll talk to her too. Circulate some emails.
Yeah, reach out to Dick and me on this.
Alice? On the Act 57, if any time you hear from the mental health commissioner, you might want to consider inviting the Dale commissioner as well. That's the incompetency
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
Monica White.
Well, you also need DCF here, I mean, DOC, DMH, Dale. And that one you also need to invite the chair of healthcare committee. So we've got next month full, and then in July, we'll talk about what we'll do more in September. You folks want to get out a doodle poll for a September meeting now, or do you want to wait a little bit?
Probably a good idea.
I was going to say, it'd be helpful to me to get it on the calendar. It would be helpful to get it on the calendar, I think.
Okay, so we'll have Peggy get out
I'm potential for Thursdays also. I can rearrange.
You have to for Thursday.
Yeah, if you need to.
Okay, let's stick with Tuesday and then see where we are and if it's a problem. Do that. So we'll get Peggy to send out a doodle poll in September.
Yeah.
Does that work for folks?
As long as it works better than it did last time.
Yeah, really. Oh, that one was
Well, it's a whole
awful.
new
It's a whole
format.
new format.
No,
I had
I went
a,
into it 3 or 4
I did
times
too.
trying to do it.
and then it's hard to find who has responded and what those dates are. 'Cause sometimes you need to know that to figure out what you're even gonna do. Sure?
No, that's it.
Yeah, we're ready. We're gonna shift. Okay, anything else? So we always have an update, as part of Justice Oversight with Department of Corrections. And this is really the first time that we've done this with the current commissioner. He did come in our November, I think it was November or December, maybe our December meeting, just to be introduced. But this is the first time our commissioner is here to give us an overview and an update on issues that are occurring within DOC. We always hear about population numbers, out-of-state bed numbers. There's been concern on staffing issues, how that's working out. And some general discussions. I know this is a delicate conversation because things are under investigation, but there has been some deaths that have occurred, and I'm sure that people will ask questions about. So I'll turn it over to you, Commissioner, Commissioner Demo, and welcome.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. You'll have to forgive me a bit. I have a bit of a head cold brought on by my daughter, but I'll suffer through and make sure we can be as clear and responsive to your needs as possible. So for the record, my name is Nick Demo. I'm the Commissioner of Corrections for the state of Vermont. I'm happy to give some of those top line data points for you that might provide some context to the conversation, but certainly welcome any of your questions and want to make this as responsive to your needs as possible. As of this morning, and this has been fairly consistent over the last few months, the total population in the Vermont incarcerated setting is 1,304 individuals. Of that, 1,210 are male, 94 are female. So about 92% of the population that Vermont has incarcerated as of today and generally is male, and about 7.25% are female. Of that 1,300 or so total population, 404 of those individuals are detainees. So they're in the pre-sentence phase of their incarceration. And excuse me, as of this morning, the department had 123 individuals housed out of state in our facility that we contract with in Mississippi. I will pause there in case there's questions about the population data or if you want me to dig into any of those particular data points. But as I mentioned, those numbers are fairly consistent over the last 6 months or so, ebbs and flows here and there. The only number that's changed, a fair bit as a percentage of its total is the out-of-state bed count. If you'll remember, when I started in this role in November, that number was about a couple dozen higher than where it is today. And so we've slowly continued to whittle that number down over the last 6 months. So I'll pause there if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to answer anything else that you may want to discuss. And we can certainly talk about staffing, some of the issues we've had in the facilities over the last few months, or whatever is the most responsive to your needs.
And we do have a question.
No, I was going to look at where these people are being housed, but I see that you have that on
Yes.
screen.
Yeah,
So
I'm sorry. I would just say that's fairly consistent with what you'd expect just based on the size of the facilities that we have. Remembering that Chittenden is our only female facility, and so our female population is exclusively housed at the Chittenden Regional Facility in South Burlington. Large population at both Northern State and Southern State being our two largest prisons.
The detainee number seems to have increased quite a bit to get up to 444. And then I've noticed that the women's numbers are creeping up as well. That's just.
Yeah, I would say, in the 6 months that I've been here, the number of incarcerated women has varied from the low 80s to the high 90s. So this is, probably higher than it's been at times, but it's fairly consistent over the last 6 months or so. I do agree that I think we've seen an uptick in total detainees. And I think there's some anecdotal reasons I could point to for that, but couldn't really say with precision exactly why that is. I think a lot of it has to do with the thawing of the pandemic and moving back to a more regular judicial process, but that would be a supposition on my part.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before he continues? Okay. Go ahead, Commissioner.
So if we turn away from the total population and flip to the staff side of the house, this remains our greatest challenge, I would say right now. Of the security related positions, so really those positions in the facilities, we have about a 20% vacancy rate. The good news story is recruitment has been quite strong in the last few months. We currently have an academy running right now with 22 recruits, and we have an accelerated academy that we're starting earlier than normally scheduled to be able to pick up on that trend in mid-July. So on the recruitment side, we're doing pretty well. We continue to try to address our retention issues. And as you can imagine, much of that is the result of the number of overtime hours being worked, the stresses incumbent in working in some of our facilities, and the pressures that were put on by the pandemic. But we're trying to target that from a variety of different approaches. And we're, I think, making some good progress there. And really the goal of our efforts right now is to create the structures that'll enable us to sustainably recruit and retain our talent. And so we know that if we can't retain the talent that we have, the recruitment isn't really all that important. We've got to really make sure that we're keeping talent and then overlaying the new and good talent that we're able to draw in right now. And so we're optimistic about our recruiting numbers, but still have quite a bit of work to do, to be candid.
So Commissioner, I know you had a graduating class of new COs back in May, and I think there was about 18 folks that graduated back then. Are they still, a month later, have any of them left?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. I can tell you we have had at least one of those individuals leave. But I think in general, that class has done quite well in the facilities. I've had the opportunity, I know you were there for the graduation, Representative. I've had the opportunity to visit with some of them in the facilities, and it seems like things are going pretty well with the folks that I was able to talk with. And I think we're seeing, I would say we're investing more work on the front end to make sure that the folks that we're recruiting really are the talent we're looking for. We're doing more robust background checks. We're doing more thorough interviewing processes to increase the quality of applicant and candidate that we ultimately hire. And I think that we are seeing a result of higher retention for those recruits than we had seen in the past when some of the standards were lower. So I think on that front, we are having some success, and hopefully the goal is to retain all the folks that we do recruit.
Questions?
Thanks. Commissioner, I know that, talking about training, that your position on the governance committee at our Vermont State Training Facility is vacant. Do you plan on filling that position?
Do you mean the position for the director of the academy?
No, no, you're allowed a position on the governance committee of the academy. That position is now vacant, according to the website. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, if you have any yet.
I don't at the moment.
Council? Is that the training,
The governance committee at the facility,
but that's not the
training council.
Not the training council.
Right.
Okay.
So that's something certainly that I can look into and respond back to you on. It's our intention to certainly be good partners with, our other law enforcement. And I know we have a position on the council that I think the representative was just referencing. Certainly we want to be good partners there and provide our support. So that's certainly something I can look into and get back to you on.
Thank you, because I had heard a rumor towards the end of the session that DOC may be trying to back out of that particular committee. So I would like to chase that down a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's true. At least I haven't heard anything along that way, but certainly I can get you an answer on that.
Thank you.
Happy to.
Nothing else on this end, Commissioner, so keep going.
So I just wanted to flag kind of one other big news story for us, and that's that we have recently put a request for a proposal out for bids on our comprehensive health services contract for health services that are provided in the department. I think this effort resulted from a recognition that the scope of healthcare and the way we provide healthcare has changed quite dramatically now through the pandemic, and really the needs of our population is changing. And so we thought it was a good time, as this contract draws to an end, to rescope the health services contract to make sure that we're providing the best possible healthcare and really aiming to provide the Vermont community standard of care versus a correction standard of care to those individuals who are in our care and custody. And so I'm excited to work through that process and share the results of that with you. And I think that it will help us to retool as we look to kind of a new landscape for healthcare in Vermont, but specifically within our facility.
When do you anticipate making a decision in terms of, the RFP is out, when do you anticipate making a decision? Because the current contract expires next year.
Yeah, it expires in July of 23. And as you well know, these processes take a little while. So we just recently posted the RFP, and so that's open for several weeks. And then when that closes, we'll review the bids that we receive. And when we make a selection, then we can start to craft with that, with whoever the selectee is, the actual contract. So I would think sometime around the start of the session, we'll have a good sense of where it's going, and certainly look for your input as to things that you think are important that we capture in our health services. I know for me, one of the key priorities going into the next contract will be the provision of mental health services. And we're seeing, kind of a huge reverberation from the pandemic and other pressures in society on the system that our population is dealing with. Some acute mental health problems, some emotional and physical health problems. We want to make sure that we're providing the necessary care to the individuals while they're in our custody.
Great, thank you. Teresa?
Commissioner, another area that we'd also be interested in is the extent of substance use, misuse support services for individuals, both in-house and as they transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties very neatly in with our goals as we look at substance misuse, mental health care, emotional health care. Those are key priorities of ours, and we know that those things are linked in many cases. And so really treating the underlying issues is important to us. And I think we're in a good position now, and I think we can only continue to improve on that.
So that sort of leads into another area where, and it's a delicate area, you have had some deaths while folks are incarcerated. And also there's now a current situation of a juvenile female being housed in one of your facilities as well.
Right.
That's maybe creating issues as well. So if you could touch base on those two within reason that you can, because I know that they're under investigation. And the case of the juvenile being held in Chittenden Regional is going through the courts.
Correct. Yeah, thank you for raising those. So you're right to highlight in the Vermont correction system, we've had 5 deaths this year, which is quite a high number for us and a troubling trend line. In some of the instances, I think there's some common threads that need exploration. And in other instances, pre-existing illness or issues outside of anybody's control were the root cause. Those investigations, all 5 of them are ongoing. And as many of you probably know, the department, for each individual who dies in our custody, the department conducts an administrative review. Our healthcare provider conducts its own independent review, and then the department outsources an independent medical review to double check that information. In each instance, also the Vermont State Police and the State Defender General's Office through the Prisoners' Rights Office conduct investigations into those matters, and we support those investigations wherever we can. So all 5 of those efforts are still underway. Some pieces of the investigation have concluded, but I think until we have a final result for each of those, I'd be remiss to go too deep into that. What I will say, though, is it became very clear to me that we needed to take a holistic review of the system and make sure that we are, in fact, doing everything possible to prevent this type of event. And so in partnership, the Defender General and I have organized an effort to jointly review commonalities in deaths that have occurred in the department's system over the last 18 months. And our staffs are working together to look at those commonalities and then come up with recommendations if there are common threads of how we could prevent or mitigate those specific threads to prevent these issues going forward. And that just builds on the partnership that I think we spent a lot of time during the last session and even after that between the Department of Corrections and the Defender General's Office cultivating. And I think we're seeing some really great collaboration there. And so we'll be happy to share some of those recommendations with you when we get further down the road. We're still in the kind of investigative or coordination phase of that effort. But that's one way that we're trying to get after this. Well, we also preserve kind of the integrity of the independent investigations that are going on.
Great, thank you. That sounds very fruitful.
Yeah, happy to answer any questions on that topic, or I'd be happy to discuss the issue relating to a juvenile we have in our custody at the moment. Okay. So again, this is a particularly sensitive matter, and I want to respect the sensitivity, but I'll highlight that we were ordered by one of the Vermont courts to take custody of an individual who's held without bail right now for some very serious charges. And that individual is a female. She's currently housed at the Chittenden Regional Facility. The department is pulling out all of the stops to ensure that we can provide that individual with the care and resources that she needs, but also recognizing that this individual is unique, is more vulnerable than some of the general population that we have. And so we want to make sure that we're getting her the mental health resources, making sure that we get her just the social contact and outside time and access to books and reading materials and things of that nature. And so we really, in kind of a unique way, pulled out all the stops to make sure we could do that for her. She is being housed in her own housing unit, which is a requirement for us under federal law. Despite what the state courts would have allowed us to do and have her be within sight and sound contact with adults, there's a federal law that's controlling on that topic that prevents that. And so we are adhering to the federal law, but making sure that we really do provide that wraparound service for her to address those needs. And we're working with our partners at DCF to help find the most appropriate placement for her, which I think all agree is probably not an adult correctional facility. And so we're working on that right now. I can't provide a lot more detail than that, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay.
But just one question, Commissioner. She is charged as an adult, which I think takes her out of the DCF realm. Normally, back in the day when Woodside was operational and a youngster was charged with, as an adult, they would normally be placed in Woodside and treated, even though they're a corrections kid. There is no Woodside. And I would guess that most of the placements that are available would not take somebody who's charged as an adult. Is that true, or are there places that will take people charged as an adult to also have juveniles? The same federal law as that.
So I think it may be true, Senator. In this case, there are some other factors at play that really do preclude us from putting her in many of the other placements we might consider. I think it is appropriate that she be in a secure placement, which many of the offerings around Vermont are not. And so that's why, exploring Sununu or an option like that is
I was asking more about Sununu, Commissioner, because my understanding is they wouldn't take somebody who's charged as an adult.
I believe they will, sir.
Okay.
And I think the issue is really, as it relates to the federal law, the issue is that the individual, if they're a juvenile, cannot be in contact with an adult. But those Sununu and facilities like that service just juvenile clients. And so the sight and sound separation issues don't apply to them.
I suppose it's a question for DCF, but since the planned facility at Newberry was only for males, that would leave you as the option in the future as well.
Yeah, I can't comment on DCF's plans for the Newberry facility. I think that is probably best left to them. What I'll say is, I think we're all in agreement that adult facilities are probably not the right venue for this. However, I just wanted to highlight some of the amazing work our staff has done. Knowing that we were the last best option, we did the needful and made sure that we had a housing environment for this young lady that was appropriate, that she has kind of a one correctional officer to incarcerated individual ratio. So it's 1-to-1. We've ensured that almost exclusively the staff who have been working with her are female, to recognize some of the needs that she may have and be responsive to those. And we've provided her with a full suite of services. And I'd also like to highlight some of the amazing work that our outside group service providers have done with her. And so I don't think that this should be the long-term option, but it is something that the department stepped up and really has done an impressive job with to make sure that while we work through a longer term solution, we have somewhere where we can really provide what this individual needs.
We're doing the best we can with what we have.
Sounds like they're doing a great job.
Yeah. But long term, we really hope it's not DOC that will be the responsible entity long term. In the short term, you are doing yeoman's work, and we want to thank you for that.
Yeah, and I just couldn't say enough about the team down at Chittenden. They really have made the very best of what is a very difficult situation.
Any other questions, concerns from the committee? Anything you want to ask or talk about with the commissioner before we finish up? Anything else from you, Commissioner, you want to share?
No, I appreciated the opportunity to be here with you all. Happy to do this whenever you're interested, and certainly I'm excited to work with you on some of the key topics that we have coming up the rest of this year and getting ready for the next session next year.
Around the corner. We are meeting again on July 12th, and there are some reports the DOC would be submitting. And our alleged counsel, Peggy Delaney, will be reaching out to Rachel. There is one report for sure, which is on the midpoint probation review. And then we are also going to be looking from DMH, a report on the competency to stand trial and insanity as a defense, which sort of leads into a discussion of a forensic unit. So DOC may want to be in the room for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So, thank you, Commissioner.
All right, thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you on the July 12th.
All right. Hope everybody stays well.
Yes, and you stay well
Feel
too.
better.
Thank you.
Take care.
So for the committee, that ties up our work for today, unless there's any outstanding issue.
Completing by 3 o'clock.
I know. We did it. Anything else before we finish and go off of YouTube? So thank you, folks. We're done for today. Our next meeting is July 12th.
Thank you, Ben.
Are we off YouTube? We still